our last program, we showed a talk by it was a talk given to the Tapestry congregation of the Unitarian Church, and was given by a woman named Claire Young. Let me make sure I have that name correctly. Claire Young, and who was a Chinese American woman. And I mentioned that because it was important to her talk. She mentioned that herself. It was important to her talk. She's kind of an outsider, looking at things as an outsider. The name of her talk was, "What Does Alabama Mean? Bearing Witness to Racism in the U.S." And it's about a trip that she took to Alabama. She visited uh, some of the most prominent sites of some major events in the part of the civil rights movement that took place in the 1950s and the 1960s. And is telling about what she saw, what she heard, what she felt, and people that she spoke to. And we're going to pick up that conversation today because she had a lot of insightful and important things to say. And to discuss this, to discuss her talk, we have we have Sandra Towns Ward and Sandy Fairley. If you've watched this program before, you may very well have seen them both. They've been on more than once. Or if you live in Laguna Woods, you may very well know them. They're both active members of the community, and they're both active members of the African American Heritage Club. So first, I want to thank you both for being here today, because this is a time of year when people's time is at a premium. So we really appreciate you both being here today, and welcome. And I'm going to start right away. I'm going to start with Sandra. I'm going to start with you. Yes, you were born in the South. You were raised in the South. That's my understanding. At the time of what we call the Jim Crow South, when these Jim Crow laws were still in effect. Yes. So, I mean, my basic question is, what was that like? I mean, was the fact that it was violence and terroristic threats and potential violence, potential death all around you? Was that part of your everyday experience? Did you wake up in the morning thinking about that, having to take that into consideration?
Yes. First of all, I'd like to start off the beginning. I was born in 1947, and my father was in the Navy. He was a Navy veteran. He served in World War II over the South Pacific. And I was actually born in Norfolk, Virginia, outside the naval base. And we lived in a segregated part, well, the South, segregated South, but the city we lived in was very much segregated, and we didn't have much interaction with whites. I went to when I started grammar school, the school was all Black. And so that was the life then. I don't remember a whole lot which occurred. And and my parents never talked about what was going on with the segregation there. So the only thing I learned while I was a little girl there is my great aunt told me that her brother disappeared one night. And I asked her, I said, what happened to him? And she said, they came and got him. And he was lynched. And they never saw him again. And they don't know why. Just they came and got him. And, she referred to the whites, came, knocked on the door, came, got him, and that was it. So as a young girl, I was trying to process that. It was very hard to understand later on. I could go back, but no one ever talked about what went on that I can remember. None of my parents or grandparents ever mentioned anything that occurred while they were living. And my father is from Virginia as well. So, but he never mentioned anything about all his experience. From there, when I was about 8 years old, we moved to Rhode Island, which was a contrast. And that was and what we had experienced in Virginia. And the town we lived in was a small town outside of the base, was predominantly white. And there were very few Blacks, mostly from the military. And in my elementary school part, I was the only Black in my class. And so we were kind of a novelty there, but it was a different experience. Our neighbors were white. We played with the kids and everything. So that was our life we knew back then. So we stayed there about 4 years. And then my father got transferred to Georgia, a town outside of Brunswick, Georgia. So on the way there, we had to drive from Rhode Island to Georgia. We went through the Carolinas, through Alabama, Mississippi, and then we got to Georgia. But on the way there, my mother had to remind us that when we stopped, we couldn't go to all the restrooms. So they would be labeled women, men, and colored. So she said, don't go into those, go into the colored uh, restroom. So that was kind of a shock to us learning that. And then I remember, I think we were driving through Alabama and Mississippi, and we had to stop. My father stopped and said, we're going to go to the restaurant and get something to eat. And when he went inside, and I went with him, um, he was told right away that he couldn't come in. We couldn't serve you. However, since you had kids, there were four of us, and you can go around to the back door and get some food. And so we went around to the back door, and it was a kitchen. Inside of the kitchen, they were all black cooks serving whites that were eating in the front. So when then they were very nice, and they sat us down and gave us all this food. So when we went back to the car, I said, Daddy, said, they're whites eating in the front, but they're blacks that are cooking the food. So figure that out. But that's how it was back in those days. This was in the 50s. So
it's kind of right in your face.
It's right
getting
in your
around
face.
it. There was
yeah. This is right in your face. So when we got to Georgia, there was a small rural town outside of, I think it was right on the coast. And we lived in a segregated neighborhood. There were no whites around. I went to an all black school that was very much dilapidated compared to the white school I went to in Rhode Island, but we had to survive through that. And one of the things I most remember was, and I was starting junior high school then, that there weren't any whites around. We never saw any. We had very little interaction with whites. They lived in another section of the town, but we never had any interaction with them. Needed to, maybe every now and then some of them would come through our little town area that we live, but we never had any interaction with them at all. It was our world was all black, schools, everything, and churches, activities. They used to have fairs that went on, but during certain times of year they had a county fair, but they had a day for the blacks to go to the county fair, and the whites with their day. So anyway, that's how we lived. But the most frightful thing that I can remember that occurred, my younger brother, had severely burned his face, and he was playing with some other kids in matches. So my mother was working at a restaurant at the time. She had to come home from there, and she took him to one of the local hospitals. And they told her his face was all burnt, scales. They told her that they could not treat him there because they don't treat colored. And mind you, we had insurance because the Navy's had insurance and medical insurance, but they could not treat him. However, they did give her some medicine and some ointments and things to treat. And they said you could take him home and try it. And then she had to end up calling a doctor. There was a black doctor that lived in the town there. But anyway, she had to take him home and treat him herself. And that was my mother was heartbroken. It was devastating, that's how it was. I mean, I'm sure there were other things that went on that were just
traumatic. Just didn't know about that. Let me go to Sandy here and ask basically the same question. You were born and raised in different circumstances. You were born up north, right? And so your circumstances were different. Does what Sandra was saying, does that ring true for your experience too, living up north?
My experience was really different. I grew up in Detroit, Michigan, And we lived, uh, the house that we lived in that I remember first was my grandmother's home was on the east side of Detroit. And it was a predominantly Black neighborhood, but it was really nice. My grandmother owned the house and there were other people who rented rooms in that house. But when I was 5 years old, we moved to a new area on the west side of Detroit. And the neighborhood was predominantly Jewish. And so we moved there. And so as soon as we moved in, there were some kids knocking on the door asking, "Do you have any kids?" And my mom said, "Yes," because I have an older sister. She said, "I have two." And they said, "Well, let them come out and play." And so as a little girl, from 5 to, I'd say 10, 11 years old, my playmates were predominantly Jewish kids. I think there was one other Black family on the block, but my experience there was very pleasant. They just wanted kids. I mean, we played, we did things. I went to a school that was very integrated. The elementary school had Black kids, Jewish kids, white kids. It was very integrated, the elementary school. I'll never forget that because there were a lot of Jewish students. And so when there was a Jewish holiday, um, half the school would be gone. So we would always have a lot of fun at school because we didn't have a full class. But anyway, that's my memory of school there was great. And my memories of that community are still strong in my heart. The bakeries, the Jewish bakeries, the delis, all of that are the things that I was exposed to. And again, I didn't see a lot of the things. And of course, I saw Jewish people as being white people. And of course, they are, I mean, they get treated as if they're different, but they are. And my interaction was very pleasant. And and then even like as the neighborhood did slowly start to change so that it became predominantly Black, but it was a nice community. We had nice manicured lawns, and it was like I mean, I would probably now say it was a lower middle class, but we just thought of ourselves as middle class. Most of the people there worked in the automobile factories. And so they were pretty well compensated comparatively. And so they had nice little houses, and we weren't rich, but we lived very comfortably. When I went to high school, which was, I was telling you, I went to a great high school in the Detroit, Michigan called Cass Technical, and it was for a B plus students. You had to have a B average and you had to maintain a B average to stay in the school. But when you went there, you declared a major. You majored in science or engineering or music, or there were science and arts students, et cetera. And we had a lot of um, most of 90, probably 97% of the students went on to higher education there. So it was a great school, and we had a great mixture of people from different parts of the city. So, as I told you, there were segregated communities in Michigan, but we weren't. I mean, it was Dearborn, Michigan, which it's really interesting. Dearborn, Michigan was started by Henry Ford, and so what they had there was what they call what do you call it, sundowning. So you could go in there and work, but you had to be out before it got dark. And we knew it. I mean, it was like a joke. We didn't need to go there, so we didn't worry about it.
Right.
There were a lot of things going on in the city that, as a child, I wasn't aware of it. There was definitely redlining going on. There was all kind of
Of
little
course.
things going on, but we didn't see it because we lived comfortably and there was no outward threat. against Black citizens in my community. And I know there had been some, and there were times when there were things that were done um, that I learned about later. For instance, when they put freeways in Detroit, they eliminated some of the prosperous Black communities. Those are the kind of things that especially were done in Detroit, the northern cities, where, I mean, Pasadena did that with the Hispanic population. When they put the Pasadena freeway in, they they just relocated complete Mexican communities there. So there were things that were going on, but you don't really hear about them or know about them as a child, and it didn't really phase you.
It's interesting. I mean, you both come from two totally different backgrounds. Really, it's an interesting situation. So I want to move, and Sandra, let me ask you about this first, and Sandy, then I'd like you to comment on it also. I just want to look down, make sure I get her quote right. One of the things that Celia Young said in her talk was she was she was in a place. She said the streets were all perfectly clean because they had been swept away of all history. And that seems to me that's a movement that is coming to more and more prominence today. There's groups of people who are trying to eradicate parts of American history, especially parts that deal with the African American experience. So, Sandra, what do you think of that? And why do you think it's important that we remember the history that happened in a real sense?
Right. I'd like to go back to and also mention in high school, we stayed in Georgia, the South, Georgia particularly, for about 4 years. Then we moved back to Virginia because, and then in high school it was segregated, in Virginia, and I went to all Black high school, and there was violence there because at that point in time, this was in the 60s, and that they were trying to integrate. So there were violence going on as well. And I did not have the luxury of attending a white school, even though they were trying to integrate at that time. But I went to an all Black high school. There was only one high school in Norfolk, Virginia, and we lived right near the base. So we had to get the bus going to our high school, which we passed by 2 or 3 white high schools. That one was brand new, and the kids would wait on the corner when they saw our bus and start throwing rocks. And so they told us to make sure the windows were down. And there were all kinds of other violence incidents that occurred. But those things, it wasn't well publicized. In fact, we had to march in my junior year to the school board to protest the deplorable conditions of our high school. It was over 50 years old. It was the only high school that Blacks could go to. And roof was leaking. We had none of the luxuries that Sandy was able to enjoy in her high school. So, so we protested. The group of us left school one day, went down to the school board in downtown to bring our attention to our school. And they greeted us with contempt. I guess they wanted to arrest us, but they told us that we were going to be suspended for 2 days, go back to school, and that was it. So those kinds of things, I can see why they don't want that to be told in the schools. I mean, that's the way it is, because some people feel that why bring up those cases there, because it creates hostility to bring up the history and what occurred back then. That's
Sandy,
my.
I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I apologize. But Sandy, why do you think it's important that we teach these things, that we remember these things, that the kind of things that Sandra was talking about, that she was going through? It's 2 different experiences, you and her, that you and her had.
Yeah, well, I think it's important for the same reason Cecilia was talking about it, is that you need to remember things so you don't repeat them. And you start watching the climate that is going on in this country, and I think that's what prompted her. I know she's doing Cecilia, Dr. Young is making um, some suggestions about the principles within her church, but I think that this effort that's going on in this country to suppress history
Mm-hmm.
is and their logic is troubling.
It is.
That people think, well, people will feel bad. Well, just think about the people that were subjected to that, and
Mm-hmm.
the tendency to go back to it. I mean, just like the Jewish community does not want anyone to forget the Holocaust. We don't want to people to forget any suppressed people or oppression that's going on, because we are too prone as human beings to repeat the same mistakes. It's very important to know your history, not to make you feel bad, but to make you more dedicated to treatment of every people. The thing with Dr. Young that really struck me is I think she is Chinese American, but she was looking at what happened at Blacks, and she said this could happen to Chinese. And she talked about how she felt when um, they started talking about the China virus and the number of Chinese people who were attacked here in the United States just because they are Chinese, and the pandemic they blamed on China. Um, the Japanese were put in internment camps during World War II. There's all kinds of people who have been systematically oppressed over the history of the world, let alone the United States. We need to know about that because we need to have empathy for every group of people that is oppressed. I mean, it's just, it's one of those things where hiding something, first of all, it's never hidden. You cannot conceal the truth. The truth will always come out. But
Exactly.
this movement is very troubling. The states of Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, I think, Louisiana especially, they have legislations right now trying to redistrict um, the voting power. This is a big move against the Black vote in the South, and that these are all results of the Supreme Court removing the sanctions against them changing redistricting without getting federal approval. And when you do that, you make people vulnerable. So it's good to remember what happens, and this effort to minimize the ability of people to vote and to minimize the information that people have is troubling for me, very troubling.
It's a great, what they call on television, a segue, because that's the next thing I want to get into. This is the last thing we'll have time to actually discuss. But one of the things that Cecilia mentioned in her talk was about a landowner in Alabama who rented out his land. He had a lot of land. He rented it out to sharecroppers, mostly African American people of color. And he ended up evicting them all at once because they had gone to register to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's something that Sandra, I'm going to ask you about this. This is something that we see making it difficult to vote, and laws that are literally designed to prevent certain groups of people from voting, mostly people of color. So, Sandra, tell us about your thinking about that. That still continues today. What do you think? What do you think of that? I can imagine, and is there any potential solution that you can think of?
It's real. I, I lived in Texas prior to coming here 5 years ago. And the minister at our church was urging the congregation. It was predominantly an African American church, Baptist church there outside of Fort Worth, and he was telling us about his experience in trying to vote. He came from the Houston area, and he said that at one point his family couldn't vote because they couldn't pay the poll tax. And I said, I'd never heard of poll tax. But later when I asked him about, and that was prior to the Voting Rights Act being implemented, but they had in Texas, they had the poll tax, and they also had a literacy tax as well. And so the difficulties, if you did want to vote, you either had to pay the poll tax. And it was, I forgot the amount was, but in today's dollar term, it probably maybe $25, $30. And that for many Blacks there, that was something they could barely afford. But even if they were able to pay that or pass a literacy test, and sometimes you have to be a landowner. They had different laws. You had to go through intimidation. They were, their homes could be bombed and whatever. And even if they made it to the polls, they could be beaten up. So there were a lot of obstructions for Blacks in the South to vote as well. And I can only imagine what they went, for most of them, it just mattered, why bother to vote? Because my life would be at risk.
Andy, how about you? I mean, it seems to me that the tactics might have changed a little bit, maybe, but it's still, barriers are still being put up. The people who vote.
Yes.
Yeah, long lines, and now they want to say you can't. Someone comes along and has a food truck, they can't do that, and they can't bring them water. And why do you want to, spend and some of them you can't do a mail-in ballot, so you have to go there and stand in line for hours in the hot sun.
Yeah, and the early voting.
Yes,
the early voting has been curtailed a lot in the state of Georgia. I know. I lived in Georgia for 20 years myself as an adult, and early voting was where a lot of the Blacks vote, so they wouldn't have to stand in long lines, and they could go at various times and avoid the lines and be able to get to work. So there's a big effort going on to suppress the vote, and that's, it scares me because it can affect any group of people. Any group of people that you stop, you can come up with ways to do that if we allow that to go on.
Absolutely. Well, we're, of course, out of time. We reached our limit. So really, I want to thank you both for being here, and I want to thank you for saying what you say, for bearing witness. Is that a right?
That's what you talked about.
I know. It's hard. And I'd like to say one more thing. And I thank God that we were able to endure that. I think a lot of all of the suppression and oppression that happened, I think it made them resilient and keep to their faith. And then the churches played a lot of role in there in keeping, them strong to bear all of this that they had to go through back then.
We have to keep on.
Sorry, we do it. We are out of time. I'll have to edit otherwise.
Okay, sure.
I just want to thank you both very much. I really appreciate you being here, and I really appreciate what you had to say. So thank you all very much. This is Alan Feldman from Black and Laguna Woods Democratic Club, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much.